Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, my fellow face free yourself stressful to successful Facebook compadres. It's Bruce Ross here again with Mike Kramer and Chris Shearer, and another Facebook Live. We are once again taking you through and introducing you to the 9 elements of our Free Yourself framework. And we've spent quite a bit of time putting this together because I think as business owners, you want to build a vehicle, build a business that's going to get you to the place, the sacred place called freedom. And we're all about giving you that freedom both now in your journey towards it, but also towards at the end when you want to make your final exit, whatever that might be, business. So we're introducing ourselves, our philosophy, and the 9 elements we think are essential. And we're up now to week number 5. So take us into that, into the framework there, Chris. So these are the different elements. We've shown this to you before. This is our go-to model. And this, as simple as it looks, is actually a very powerful diagnostic tool. It's what we use whenever we look at any business to see what needs to be strengthened and where to take it next. So over the course of these weeks, we have introduced the different components. The first one was what, Chris? First one was, recap. Thank you very much. The first one was ourselves, where we're coming from. We enjoy each other's company because there's a complementary mix of skill set, systems, and overall integration. And that's the crucial part of what glues us together, but also what glues the model together. So we introduced ourselves, the philosophy. Then the second week, we introduced the concept of freedom right at the core of everything. And I think a few questions need to be asked around that. What does freedom actually look like for me? The next was, therefore, if I have this level of freedom, if this is what I'm after, how do I need to orientate or engineer my business in order that it gets me there? And the question there, therefore, is what is the ultimate business outcome that I want for my business? Now, underlying any and each of these is mindset. We have that right dead center of our model, because how we think about anything determines the results or the outcome. So we have an orientation, we call it a mindset, our attitude, our trajectory, the reality that we live inside. Mostly, when we're talking about the operating system of our mind, that's neglected. It's avoided. Most people, most business owners go straight to strategy, but for us, it's front and center. And we can talk about that, how you can build an invincible, a resilient, an agile, a flexible mindset, an absolutely essential one in these worlds, in these times. And then we moved on to leadership. And there are multiple components of leadership. There's self-leadership, there's team leadership, and there's organizational leadership. And the key considerations around that, each and every one of these is a massive territory in and of itself. But we're looking to give you overviews. And so we're now on to week 5, which is what now? So if you've been looking, thank you, Chris. So yes, we're on to strategy. So it takes us back to the Free Yourself framework yet again. And this is where we start to look at the different elements of the system. So I'm going to invite our systems expert, Mike Kramer. My first question of you, Mike, is whenever I think of strategy, or when I think, my experience, most business owners think of strategy, they think of maybe SWOT analysis, they think of vision, values, they think of plans and execution. What's the difference between how we approach strategy and how I think most business owners think about strategy?
Well, first, Chris, pull back up the Freedom Framework, because I think it's going to give everybody context in really what is an excellent strategic process. And I think to answer your question, Bruce, most organizations and most leaders think about strategy. They think about a strategic planning event. And I call it 3 days at the Radisson. What they really should be thinking about is an annual strategic process, a cycle, a strategic cycle that engages all the critical stakeholders in the organization, most important, probably the front lines, in a really valuable review of where the organization has been, where it is now, its position in the competitive and ever-changing marketplace, and then what it wants for the future.
Mm. So tell me more about all the stakeholders, because the typical approach to strategic planning is you get the executive or the lead team together and they determine, but your approach or our approach, what you're suggesting is something quite different.
Yeah, well, oftentimes, in fact, in larger organizations, they will involve outside stakeholders and frontline employees, but only in a limited sense. They'll have a survey, they'll send out a survey, they'll do an analysis of the survey, and then they feel like they've covered it. But honestly, for an excellent strategic planning process, the whole objective is to minimize a risk. So you want, and the way we refer to it is, we want the organization to take intelligent risks. So, by the way, there's a risk in not taking action at all, which a lot of smaller and mid-sized organizations, they prefer, hey, I like the status quo, I'm not going to really shake it up too much, but there's a risk in inaction as well. But in taking an intelligent risk, it's really requires that you assess all of the necessary inputs. And when you look at the Freedom Framework, it kind of gives you insight into what some of those inputs are. So first, leadership. So the traditional people who are involved in a strategic planning event. The executive team, maybe the board of directors, and a couple of advisors, right? And then they decide together what the strategic future orientation of the organization is going to be. When they do that, they neglect the other elements of the Freedom Framework. So, for example, how could you make good strategic decisions if you don't involve your customers? And not only your current customers and maybe some past customers that you lost, but also the customers you want, the ones who aren't currently buying from you. So that's one element. And the other is workforce. How do you have a really good strategic planning process if you don't engage the people who work with your customers? They hear the feedback. They know what's working. They know what's broken. They work with your expensive equipment. They attend trade shows. Their ear is to the ground of your evolving competitive marketplace. And then how do you have a good strategic planning process if you don't assess your current operational capability and capacity? And then if you don't have really holistic set of metrics beyond the financial measures of typical results, which is the final element in the Freedom Framework, but also results in terms of how well we're serving our customers, how satisfied are they, how efficient are our operations, how satisfied and engaged are our employees, what's our capacity with our employees. So all those elements need to be taken into account as far as strategic inputs in developing any kind of plan.
So, Mike, I have a question about this. So it sounds like a lot of this is really a moving target, right? I mean, there's a lot of different pieces that are changing over time, whether they're in the marketplace with the competitors, with your customers, or your desire to get other customers, with your employees as they change, and then how you actually implement processes to deliver value to them. Is there some secret in the cycle in terms of how all of that gets pulled together over time so that moving target gets addressed consistently and continually updated?
Yeah, it's so great that you mentioned that, because most strategic plans, after those 3 days at the Radisson, what happens with them? They're finished, they're filed, and they're forgotten. They're rarely implemented. I can't tell you how many times I've been brought into a strategic planning event and I ask them, can I see your last strategic plan? And then I'll review it and I'll say, well, what happened to all of these initiatives, all these priorities that you identified in your last cycle? Sometimes, it was a couple of years earlier. And they said, well, we haven't really done that much with it. And then I ask, well, are these still relevant? And they'll say, yeah, those are good. So then I ask, well, why are you going to spend more money on planning? Maybe you should focus some of your effort on implementation, So it's better. A process versus a plan is such a better approach because it meets what you just said. It's a living strategic process. It's not a fixed exercise that can be finished, filed, and forgotten. It's constantly in motion. It's alive. And what's so nice about it is, yes, there's an annual cycle, so you're constantly re-meeting the same milestones in your process, but you're continuously assessing. There's an ongoing element to it where you're constantly considering the ever-changing marketplace, the ever-changing circumstances of your business. That's part of your process.
Well, what I like about this, Mike, is my approach to the workforce side of things is how do you get your people to think and behave more like the level above them? So if it's a frontline person, how do you get them to think and behave more like a supervisor, manager, business owner? And to do that, you need to start them to shift out of an employee mindset to think more strategically about the company as a whole. So if there is the process where they not only do their job, but they're also thinking, well, how are we in the market? What's happening out there? And then how do I get to feed that in, and how can I contribute? I mean, that's powerful. That's powerful.
Well, that's another critical element to our Freedom Framework, because we really engage the employees of the adopters of the framework. They're really listened to. They know that we want to listen to them, that we value their opinions, and we value their input and their insight into what's working and what's broken. And not in just an annual cycle, but as part of the continuous improvement cycle, where every person has the ability to let us know about an issue or a problem or an idea as it occurs to them, so that we can take immediate action and we're not waiting for an annual event to discuss it. Also, at the same time, they're getting recognized for it. They get credit for it. So they really learn that they're a partner in the continuous evolution of their business. And you know what? Maybe it's more than an evolution. It's kind of a revolution. Because in most businesses, when we come in, they're not that mature. They don't have these elements in place. They're not using the Freedom Framework. But when they start using the Freedom Framework, it's almost like a revolution in their business, because there's so much opportunity, so much value to be had by just starting to listen to the right people.
So, Mike, you actually mentioned a word there that made me think of something. I was actually kind of thinking about it as you were saying it. You said the word partner, and so is it worth mentioning that there are other stakeholders, partners in this that deserve attention, right? You have potentially vendors, other people that have a stake in this ongoing process that really should have a place at the table. Not just vendors, but I think, partners, potentially anybody that's doing any kind of consulting with the company or coming from the outside. Are you seeing that being pulled into the strategic planning process as well?
Well, this is another excellent question, because that actually proves the importance of preceding planning with, gathering all the right inputs and then analyzing those inputs. How could you plan if you don't have all the information you need to make a good decision, to take a good, intelligent risk? So all those critical stakeholders that you mentioned that usually typically don't have much of a voice, those customers and those vendors and, the frontline employees, again, an assessment of your operational capability and capacity, and an analysis of all of your different product lines and customer segments. All of these inputs need to be gathered before you can even start to think about planning.
So this sounds like quite a bit of work. How might this work, or does this apply to a smaller business? And then what's the process for a smaller, medium, larger business?
Well, first I have to say that if they're in business, that they need to, and they're competing with larger businesses, that even a small business needs to drive towards as much sophistication as they possibly can if they're going to stay in business. So nobody told them to go into business. So now, let's get with the program and do the best that we can possibly do. So that's for the entrepreneurs out there who really don't want to manage with some sophistication. But that said, this is not rocket science. Obviously, part of our logo is the rocket ship. But if you simply follow our step-by-step approach, you could fly the rocket. So it's gathering those inputs. It's not that hard. It's just not managing by the seat of your pants. So you're going to take some time to think about what all those inputs are. And we give you a list of all of them. It's all very systematic. And then engaging your people in a conversation, well, you absolutely have to do that. There's no way around it. And if you're the kind of leader that just wants to take charge and have people follow you, well, you may be sorely disappointed with really poor results.
Fantastic.
So, Mike, sorry, Bruce, I was just going to say, so Mike, we're obviously big fans of having a framework and a methodology that's proven, that's been used for decades, but also having a system, right? An actual management system to pull everything together. Can you give a little bit of insight into how that changes this entire process? Having something that really permeates in a real-time basis all of these different people and activities and inputs and outputs so that it
Yes.
all works like a fine-tuned machine?
Well, in fact, I'm so glad that you mentioned that, Chris, because I don't want people to get the wrong idea that we somehow invented the Freedom Framework. This framework is the same basic framework that's used by the billion-dollar companies to become super successful. Our passion is simply to make that same tried and true gold standard framework accessible to mid-market and smaller organizations who typically haven't had access to it. So our approach is the same approach that's used by these large organizations to outmaneuver the small guy. So does that answer the question? Oh, by the way, the framework itself requires that you have a system. The system is represented by these elements. And if you could see the fine red line around the individual elements, that represents integration. And when you really integrate these elements together, then you have what we call a management machine. It's a management system. And if you think about it, how can you discuss strategy without thinking about your customers and your workforce and your operations and analyzing all of your results, right? How could you? And engage your leadership and your governance, if you have a board or an advisory board. So you couldn't. And in the same way, you couldn't think about addressing your workforce requirements or your operations without considering all the other elements. They're all interrelated. So when you look at our Freedom Framework, what I really want you to see is a management machine. It's fun to talk about strategy because it's a future orientation, but it's just as important to talk about continuous improvement, which really involves your frontline employees and the work that they perform, workforce plus operations. So that often feeds a really excellent future-oriented strategic process.
Yeah, so I think the one thing I just took away from what you said, Mike, is that integration of all these different elements is really what gives the boost, to take the analogy a little bit further, right? So being able to integrate all the pieces in a real-time basis over time with all of the different inputs and outputs together is really what's going to make it move forward together quickly and take it a lot further.
Yes, the integration is the leverage. The integration is the boost. So if you could make the rocket take off now, that would be perfect timing.
You know what? We took that out for this week, but
did we?
Next week we'll bring it
usually,
back. Next week
usually you get the green rocket to take off. It's fun.
Yeah, I know. I took it out.
Sorry. To all of our listeners, next time.
So if there's anyone out there who is interested in knowing a little bit more or wants further insight into how the integration occurs, we've put it together, codified it into what we call a 6 shifts, which is a webinar. And you can simply go online here and you watch the 6 shifts, the webinar, and it's what we consider to be the essential 6 shifts any business owner needs to make in order to make their business sustainable, scalable, and saleable, and get the freedom that they're ultimately after. So We look forward to catching up with you again next week, interacting with you on Facebook with comments and answering any questions you may have. If you want to call through, make connection with us, we can answer specific questions you may have around either strategy or each of the different 9 elements inside the Free Yourself framework. So from my side, that's all I have. Is anything else from your side, guys?
Yeah, Bruce, let's remind everybody, once they watch the 6 Shifts video, we invite them to sign up for a breakthrough session where they'll actually talk with us one-on-one. So that's really the objective for established business owners that have employees that want to really up their game in regards to strategy and engaging their employees. Well, we encourage you to listen to the 6 Shifts and then sign up for a breakthrough session.
Yeah, and I would just add too that if you have the time, if you're really interested in this, go back and watch some of the earlier sessions and think about what that freedom means to you. What is it you really want now and in the future? What is your ultimate business outcome? What are you really driving to get at? And watch the other sessions. Watch the mindset thing. Figure out where you are on that journey, because it'll put a lot of this into perspective, and it helps to go back and revisit some of these areas.
Chris, you're again mentioning something that I just have to interject one more last little thing, is that so often when you talk to a leader, their strategies are just a fraction of what they could be if their mindset was, aligned with what their business potential was. So it's so important that you mention mindset, because it's a critical part of strategy.
Yeah.
Love it.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mike and Chris, and for those of you who are watching, and we look forward to catching with you again very soon. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Bye.